Have you ever believed something just because everyone else seemed to? A headline flashes across your screen. A spiritual teacher speaks with unwavering confidence. A tradition echoes through generations. And before you even realize it, you've already accepted it as truth. Not because you know it, but because it feels familiar, because it sounds right, because to question it feels uncomfortable. But what if that comfort is the very thing that blinds us? We humans were wired to trust. It kept our ancestors alive. Trust in the tribe, trust in the elders, trust in the stories passed down by the firelight. But in today's world, flooded with opinions, algorithms, and half-truths, that same instinct becomes a trap. We trust too quickly, too easily, and sometimes too blindly. He said it. She reposted it. They've always done it this way. It must be true. We live in a time when belief is cheap. Click, share, react, repeat. And yet wisdom, real wisdom, is more rare than ever. Not because it disappeared, but because we stopped looking deeply. Let me tell you a story. A young man once followed a teacher who promised enlightenment through rituals, strange chants, symbolic gestures, and hours of rigid devotion. He did it all, every step, without question, for years. One day he asked the teacher, "Why haven't I found peace yet?" The teacher replied, "Because you believed me instead of discovering for yourself." That night the young man left. He sat beneath a tree in silence, not praying, not chanting, just observing his breath, his thoughts, his fears. Days passed, and in that stillness, he saw more clearly than ever before. That man isn't a legend. He lives in all of us. We've all had moments where we gave our power away, to authority, to tradition, to noise, but belief, when handed to us, is not truth. It's only borrowed, and borrowed truth cannot set us free. So why do we believe so quickly? Because certainty is seductive, because doubt feels dangerous, because we fear standing alone in the unknown. But what if doubt isn't the enemy? What if it's the first step to seeing clearly? The Buddha once said, "Don't go by reports or tradition or hearsay. Don't go by scripture or logical inference or philosophical reasoning. Don't even go by the authority of your teacher. But when you know for yourselves that something is wholesome, blameless, and beneficial, then you may accept and abide in it." That is radical, a spiritual teacher saying, "Don't even believe me." Because true wisdom doesn't demand belief. It invites exploration. We weren't meant to live with blindfolds, not spiritual ones, not societal ones, not the ones we tie around our minds to avoid discomfort. We were meant to see, to look, to ask, to feel the world through our own skin, not someone else's lens. And maybe that's where real transformation begins. Not in believing faster, but in slowing down, in pausing, and daring to ask, is this really true? Some truths are not found in words. They unfold in silence, in stillness, in the deep inner gaze that says, "I won't be told what to see. I will see for myself." And so the journey begins, not with blind belief, but with open eyes, eyes that refuse to be rushed, a heart that won't settle for second-hand truth, and a mind willing to walk the harder path, the one where questions are sacred and direct experience is king. Because the next step is not about rejecting belief. It's about meeting a teacher who didn't ask for your faith, only your presence, and what he said changed everything. There's a small village in ancient India, quiet, modest, not the center of politics, not the seat of power, just a humble place where people wanted peace and truth. That village was called Kalama. And one day it found itself drowning in voices, wandering monks, priests, mystics, philosophers, all passing through, each preaching their own version of the truth. One says, "This is the only path to salvation." Another counters, "No, that leads to ruin." A third says, They're both wrong, only my way will set you free. The villagers were caught in the storm, confused, torn. Whispers turned to doubts, faith turned to frustration, until finally they turned to one more traveler, a quiet man, not dressed in gold, not speaking with thunder, just walking barefoot with calm eyes and a still mind. They had heard rumors about him. Some called him the awakened one. Others just said, he doesn't argue, he sees. And so the Kalamas asked him what no one else could answer honestly. How do we know who to believe? The Buddha didn't rush to speak. He didn't quote scripture. He didn't name drop gods or lineages. Instead, he asked them to look within. And what he said would echo for centuries. Do not go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture. Do not go by logical reasoning, or by inference, or by pleasing appearances. Do not go by the authority of texts, or teachers, or your own preferences. But when you see for yourselves that something is wholesome, blameless, leading to welfare and happiness, then, and only then, should you accept and live by it. This wasn't just a rejection of blind faith. It was a revolution, a spiritual teacher telling people, don't believe me until you see for yourself. How rare is that? In a world of loud voices, demanding obedience, here stood someone asking for nothing but awareness. No submission, no guilt, no threats of damnation, just an invitation to observe. Picture it. The Kalamas sitting cross-legged in a clearing, the quiet of the forest around them, and a man in saffron robes saying, your mind is your own, use it. This is the heart of the Buddhist path, not to believe blindly, not to reject everything, but to look with open, honest eyes. We live in a time not so different. Every day we scroll through opinions, endless advice, contradictory truths dressed in confidence. One influencer says, this diet will transform your life. A guru proclaims, this method guarantees happiness. An algorithm decides what you should think before you even know you're thinking it. But in all this noise, the Buddha's words remain. Like a compass in the dark, see for yourself, test it in your life. If it leads to peace, keep it. If it feeds greed, hatred, or delusion, let it go. This isn't a philosophy. It's a practice, it's courage, it's the audacity to say, I will not follow blindly, I will not reject stubbornly, I will see. In Kalama, the people found clarity, not because someone told them what to believe, but because someone finally told them. You have the capacity to know. That's what makes this encounter timeless. It reminds us that the real authority isn't out there, not in temples, not in books, not in someone else's certainty, it's in direct experience. In the quiet space where you watch a thought rise. Feel it, and let it go, where you test a teaching, not to win an argument, but to taste its truth in the fire of your own life. And maybe that's where it all begins. Not with faith in a doctrine, but faith in your own capacity to wake up, to walk, to question, to reflect, and just ahead, we'll see what happens when belief becomes dogma, when faith loses its heart, and people forget how to see. But for now, let this truth echo gently. The Buddha never asked for your belief, he asked for your awareness. At first, faith feels beautiful. It gives us direction, comfort, a sense of belonging in a world that often feels too vast, too chaotic. It promises certainty, when life offers anything but slowly, without warning, faith can harden. What begins as devotion can turn into dogma, and dogma has a shadow. It whispers, this is the only truth. Questioning means betrayal. Those who doubt are lost. It builds walls, draws lines, divides the world into right and wrong, saved and damned, pure and impure. And suddenly, what once opened your heart now begins to close your mind. History remembers this pattern well. People burned at the stake not for crimes, but for asking the wrong questions. Nations went to war not over land, but over whose God was correct. Children taught not to explore, but to obey, to fear, to never step outside the line, all in the name of faith. But faith without reflection isn't strength, it's stagnation. There's a story of a man who prayed every morning to a sacred stone. He lit incense, bowed, whispered chants handed down by his ancestors. One day, a traveler asked him, "Why do you worship that stone?" The man paused, then answered, "Because my father did, and his father before him." The traveler nodded gently and said, "And if they were blind, are you willing to inherit their blindness?" The man said nothing. He looked at the stone, not with devotion, but with doubt, and for the first time, he really saw it. This is the moment dogma fears, the moment of clear seeing, because dogma survives on repetition, not realization, on memorization, not mindfulness. It thrives where questions are silenced, where curiosity is punished, where silence is mistaken for virtue. But truth doesn't hide from questions. In fact, it welcomes them. Because truth, real truth, doesn't fear inspection. It doesn't crumble under inquiry, it sharpens, it shines. So why does dogma still grip so many hearts? Because it's easy. It's easier to cling to a rigid belief than to walk the trembling path of discovery. It's easier to chant what you've been told than to sit quietly and observe the raw messiness of life. But ease is not the measure of truth. Comfort is not the compass of wisdom. In the Buddha's time, there were many who claimed to know the path. They demanded loyalty, required rituals. They offered salvation for submission. But the Buddha offered something far more dangerous, freedom, and with it, responsibility. He didn't hand you a final answer. He handed you a mirror, a question, a practice, because he knew belief can bind just as much as it can liberate. And when faith becomes rigid, when it stops evolving, when it cannot be questioned, it ceases to be faith, it becomes a cage. So ask yourself, are you worshiping truth or only tradition? Do you follow a path or just the footprints of those who came before? And most importantly, can you let go of the beliefs that once defined you? If they no longer serve the awakening of your heart, there is a strength in questioning, a courage in unlearning, a sacred rebellion in not settling for borrowed truths. You don't need to reject everything, but you do need to see everything clearly, honestly for yourself. Because sometimes, the first step toward real wisdom is not adopting a new belief. It's releasing the old one you never truly examined. And as the layers peel away, as old certainties dissolve, what remains is not a void, but a quiet invitation, an open door to a kind of doubt that doesn't destroy, but refines, a doubt that doesn't pull you away from truth, but pulls you closer, not the skepticism of cynics, but the reflection of seekers. And that's where we're heading next, into the quiet power of mindful doubt, where questions aren't dangerous, they're divine. There's a kind of doubt that doesn't weaken the mind. It sharpens it, not the kind born of fear, but the kind born of curiosity, not the voice that says, nothing is true, but the one that gently asks, is this really so? For centuries, we've misunderstood doubt. We were told it's a flaw, a crack in our faith, a sign of weakness. But the Buddha saw something different. He saw that when held with mindfulness, doubt becomes sacred. Think of doubt not as a wall, but as a door, a moment when the mind pauses, not to reject, but to examine, not to destroy, but to understand. That pause is powerful. That space is where transformation begins. Picture this: a woman raised in a household of strict religious rules, never allowed to ask, never allowed to wonder. She followed, she obeyed, but something inside her whispered there must be more. One day she sat alone, watching her breath, not praying, Not pleading, just watching, for the first time in her life. She let her doubt speak, not with anger, not with defiance, but with sincerity. What is true? What is real? In that silence, she wasn't turning away from the divine. She was finally turning toward it. On her own terms. This is not rebellion, this is reflection. And in a world that moves too fast, reflection is a revolution. But here's the thing, not all doubt leads to wisdom. Some doubt is scattered, restless. A mind chasing its own tail, never committing, never trusting anything, including itself. But mindful doubt is different. It doesn't demand instant answers. It's not in a hurry, it sits, breathes, watches. It creates space between belief and disbelief, between assumption and awareness. And in that space, something ancient awakens. In Buddhist tradition, this sacred type of doubt is known as vicikicca, not a hindrance but a threshold, a moment when you no longer accept truth from another's mouth, but begin to seek it with your own eyes. It is uncomfortable, it is lonely, it is raw, but it is also real. Ask yourself, when was the last time you sat with a belief? Not to defend it, but to explore it. When was the last time you allowed silence to answer a question? Instead of rushing to Google, when was the last time you said, maybe I don't know, and that's okay? Because in that not knowing, there is a kind of knowing, deeper than words. A young monk once asked his master, "How can I find the truth?" The master replied, "Let go of what you believe just for a moment." The monk hesitated, "But if I let go, won't I be lost?" The master smiled, "No, if you don't let go, you'll never be found. This is the heart of the path, not blind belief, not blind denial, but a middle way. A still point between yes and no, where clarity blooms, where the mind no longer reacts, but reflects, where truth is not borrowed, but born." And this kind of doubt, it doesn't push you away from awakening, it pulls you closer. Because it's not doubt of truth, it's doubt on the way to truth. So sit with your questions, not as burdens, but as companions. Let them walk with you, let them breathe beside you. Let them stay unanswered, just long enough to reveal what answers never could. Because sometimes, what you're really doubting is not the truth, but the voices that told you never to look for it yourself. And when the dust of inherited beliefs begins to settle, you might notice something, not a conclusion, not a doctrine, but a quiet inner flame, steady, subtle, undeniably yours, and it whispers, "Keep looking." Because on this journey, truth isn't something you're told, it's something you awaken to. And awakening doesn't begin with answers. It begins with the courage to hold a question and not let it go too soon. There comes a point when reading is no longer enough, when repeating ancient words, no matter how sacred, no longer touches the edge of truth. A moment when the map, however detailed, can no longer replace the journey itself. That moment is the turning point, the threshold between knowing and being, because truth, real truth, isn't found in books, not even holy ones. It's not in the chants, not in the rituals, not even in the most poetic teaching passed from master to student. Truth lives in direct experience, felt in your bones, known without words, confirmed not by logic, but by life itself. A student once asked the Buddha, "What is nirvana like?" And the Buddha didn't answer. He simply remained silent, not because he didn't know, but because some things cannot be described, only experienced. You can describe the taste of honey 1,000 ways, but until it's on your tongue, you haven't truly known it. So it is with awakening, with peace, with freedom from suffering. There was once a man who studied every scripture he could find. He could recite teachings backwards. He debated fiercely. He was praised for his brilliance. But he was still angry, still restless, still afraid to sit in silence. One day he met a wandering monk, silent and simple. The man asked him, "What teaching do you follow?" The monk replied, "I watch my breath." The scholar laughed. "That's all. What about philosophy, cosmology, metaphysics?" The monk smiled. "When I'm angry, I breathe. When I'm sad, I breathe. When I'm tempted, I breathe. And in breathing, I return." That night, the scholar put his books away. For the first time in years, he simply sat and breathed. We often mistake information for wisdom, but you can memorize the entire Dhammapada and still not be free, because liberation doesn't come from what you believe. It comes from how you live, what you touch, what you see with your own eyes, what you feel in the quiet honesty of this very moment. This is why the Buddha didn't just teach. He invited practice. He didn't say, "Repeat after me." He said, "Come and see." Ehipasiko, an ancient word, a radical invitation. Not to believe, but to look, to test, to feel, to live. So ask yourself, when was the last time you stopped reading about peace and actually sat down to taste it? When was the last time you stopped discussing impermanence and simply watched a flower wilt without looking away? When was the last time you turned a teaching into a lived truth? You're walking through a forest at dawn. Mist clings to the earth. Every footstep is soft, deliberate. You can hear your breath. Feel your heartbeat. Notice the thoughts as they pass, like birds overhead. You're not trying to understand anything. You're just here, present, still, alive. And in that moment, without effort, without words, you understand everything the sutras have ever tried to say. That's direct experience. Not something you believe in, but something you become. And here's the beauty of it. No one else can give it to you, no teacher, no book, not even the Buddha himself, because the truth is not taught, it is seen, it is lived. That's why in this tradition, enlightenment is not a gift you receive. It's a fire you ignite inside yourself, by yourself, through breath, through silence, through direct, unfiltered, wordless being. And the more you live like this, the more you realize you don't need to carry beliefs anymore. You carry presence, and that's enough. Because what is more powerful than belief? Knowing, not as a concept, but as a reality. You have touched with your own hands, and once you've touched that, no one can take it from you. Not with argument, not with doctrine, not even with fear. Because what you've seen, you've seen. What you've lived, you've lived. And it's yours, not borrowed, not second-hand, but direct, unshakable, real. And so we move forward, not just thinking about truth, not just believing in it, but walking it, living it, letting it shape our breath, our gaze, our choices, because beyond belief, beyond doubt, beyond dogma, there is the clarity of your own experience, and in that, everything begins to change. We're living in the loudest time in human history. Our ears are flooded, our minds, even louder, buzzing phones, endless scrolling, opinions stacked like towers of Babel, notifications that ping like digital mosquitoes, tiny bites that steal our stillness. Everywhere we turn, someone is speaking, selling, preaching, posting. In this avalanche of information, we are starving for wisdom. But here's the truth few want to admit. Wisdom doesn't shout, it whispers. And to hear it, you have to do something rare, radical even. You have to pause, you have to stop. You have to listen not just to the world, but to what's behind it. The Buddha once said, "Silence is the language of the awakened." Why? Because when the world is loud, truth hides, but in stillness, truth begins to glow, not in neon lights, but like moonlight on water. Quiet, subtle, clear. Think about it. When was the last time you truly paused? Not for distraction, not to check your phone, not to fill time, but paused. To see, to notice your breath, to feel the sunlight on your skin, to watch your thoughts rise and fall like waves, without chasing any of them, to simply be, without needing to be anything. There's an old Zen story. A young monk asks his teacher, "What is the path to enlightenment?" The master says nothing. Instead, he pours tea into a cup and keeps pouring until it overflows. The student panics. "Stop, it's full." The master nods. "Exactly. How can I show you truth if your mind is already overflowing?" And that is the noise we carry. We're so full of opinions, facts, memories, fears, that there's no space for truth to land. But when we pause, we begin to empty, and only then can something deeper enter. In Buddhism, this pause is more than silence. It's sati, mindfulness, the art of remembering to come back to this very moment, not later, not after everything is perfect. Now, because now is the only place truth ever shows itself. Try it, even now. As you're listening, pause, breathe. Notice the sound between my words, the stillness between thoughts. That space, that's where awareness lives. That's where you are. Not the you with opinions and roles and labels, but the witness beneath all that. And when that witness awakens, everything changes. You don't have to retreat to a monastery. You don't need silence from the world. What you need is to create silence within the world, to be the calm in the storm, the watcher in the noise, the clarity inside confusion. Even as the world screams, you learn to listen more deeply, not to it, but to you, and something beautiful happens. You begin to see that not every thought is true. Not every emotion is forever. Not every voice deserves your energy. You begin to see patterns, habits, attachments, illusions. You begin to see yourself, and in that seeing, freedom begins, one breath at a time, one pause at a time. You reclaim yourself from the noise, because mindfulness is not just calmness. It is the quiet courage to look honestly, and in that gaze, you start recognizing what's real, what matters, what you can let go of. So pause, even for just 5 breaths a day, even for 1 minute of undistracted presence. Pause, not to escape the world, but to see it clearly, and through that seeing, you begin to live, not automatically, not reactively, but with depth, with wisdom, with truth born not from belief, but from presence. Because in a world full of noise, the rarest act is to be still, and the rarest wisdom is the one you realize when you finally pause long enough to see. There was a time when we believed without question. As children, we believed in monsters under the bed. We believed the sun followed us when we walked. We believed every adult had the answers, and maybe that innocence was beautiful. But what happens when we carry that same innocence into adulthood? When we let go of curiosity and replace it with blind acceptance? That's the danger of gullibility. It's not just naivety, it's an abdication of awareness. It's what happens when we surrender our inner compass and let the world drive our decisions. We mistake noise for truth, charisma for wisdom, certainty for insight, and in doing so, we forget to look within. Buddhism doesn't ask you to believe, it asks you to see, to examine, to question, to test everything against your own heart and mind. That's why the Buddha told the Kalamas, do not go by reports, by traditions, by hearsay, but when you know for yourselves, these things are wholesome, then accept them and live accordingly. It's not faith, it's clarity, and clarity doesn't come from agreeing with someone. It comes from seeing for yourself. There's an old parable. A man once came to a sage and asked, "Master, how do I find truth?" The sage smiled. "Walk into the forest with a bowl of water filled to the brim. Don't spill a drop, and don't let anything distract you." So the man walked. He passed preachers shouting from the hills, merchants offering secret wisdom, friends begging him to stop and listen, but he kept walking, silent, focused, balanced. When he returned, the sage asked, "What did you learn?" The man whispered. "That the world is full of voices, but my truth comes when I listen inside." That's the journey. From gullibility to wisdom, not by becoming cynical, not by rejecting all voices, but by learning to discern, to pause before agreeing, to test before accepting, to feel before following. Wisdom begins when you stop asking, "What should I believe?" and start asking, "What do I know in my bones to be true?" In the modern world, gullibility doesn't look like ignorance. It looks like scrolling for hours, clicking headlines without reading, reposting quotes because they sound deep. It's when we trade depth for dopamine. And here's the dangerous part. The more we outsource our thinking, the more disconnected we become from our own wisdom. But that wisdom has never left. It's waiting, not in a book, not on a screen, not from a guru, but inside the quietest part of you, the part that sees clearly when you're brave enough to look. So ask yourself, what beliefs am I carrying that I've never questioned? What truths do I hold simply because they comfort me? When was the last time I allowed myself to not know, to be truly curious? Because curiosity is not a weakness, it's a portal from mental autopilot to awake awareness. And the Buddha's path isn't about memorizing doctrines. It's about becoming so clear, so mindful. That truth reveals itself without being forced. True wisdom feels different from opinion. It doesn't rush. It doesn't need to be right. It doesn't shout over others. It just is, like a mountain that doesn't argue with the wind. When you meet someone truly wise, you don't feel pressure. You feel peace, because real wisdom doesn't try to impress you. It tries to free you, and freedom begins when you stop letting others do your thinking. This is your journey, not your parents', not your teacher's, not your traditions, yours. And the more you walk it, the more you'll see that truth is not something you're given. It's something you uncover, layer by layer, illusion by illusion, assumption by assumption, until all that's left is clarity. So walk the path, not as a believer, but as an explorer. Trust not in what is said, but in what you see, what you feel, what you live, because wisdom isn't handed down, it's grown within. And every step you take away from blind belief is a step closer to your truest self, the self that doesn't need to be told, because it already knows. We live in an age of infinite information, but not necessarily infinite wisdom. You can ask your phone anything, and in seconds you'll get 10,000 answers, quotes from saints, tweets from strangers, conflicting studies, confusing conclusions. The world is no longer silent, it's screaming, and in the noise, we forget how to listen to ourselves. But this is where the Kalama principle becomes more than a philosophy. It becomes a compass, not just to protect you from being deceived, but to help you live wisely every single day. The Buddha didn't teach the Kalamas to mistrust everything. He taught them to test everything, not with cynicism, but with clarity, not with anger, but with awareness. He gave them a tool, one that's just as essential now as it was 2,500 years ago, because truth doesn't get old, it gets covered. So what does it look like to apply the Kalama principle today? It starts with this. Don't believe just because someone sounds confident. Confidence isn't truth, it's volume. And in a world where everyone's trying to go viral, volume is cheap. Instead, ask, is this teaching helping me become more mindful? Does it lead to peace or more confusion? The Buddha said, when you know for yourselves that these things are wholesome, conducive to welfare, then enter and abide in them. That's your litmus test, your filter, your spiritual radar. Let's bring it down to real life. You hear a self-help guru say, you must cut off all negative people immediately. Sounds empowering, right? But stop, reflect, is it true for you, or is it just dramatic? Does isolating from every difficult person make you wiser, or just more alone? Now contrast that with this reflection. Maybe I can set boundaries with compassion. Maybe I can protect my peace without losing empathy. That's not trendy, but it's true, and it leads to wholesomeness. The Kalama principle doesn't tell you what to do. It teaches you how to see clearly before you act. Or take another example. You're scrolling and you see a quote. Just trust the universe. Vague, mysterious, popular, but ask yourself, does this idea help me take responsibility? Or does it encourage passivity? The Kalama principle doesn't reject mystical ideas, but it challenges you to ask, is this empowering me to act with mindfulness and ethics, or just giving me an excuse to escape effort? This principle is also about self-reflection, because sometimes the most dangerous beliefs aren't from others, but from ourselves, the voice that says, I'm not good enough, I always mess things up, I'll never change. Where did that belief come from? A teacher, a parent, a single moment of failure? And why do you still carry it? The Kalama principle invites you to challenge even those internal voices, to say, wait, is this true? Is this skillful? Does it serve my growth? Because not every thought deserves your trust, even if it sounds like your own. Practical wisdom means living with filters, not walls. It's being open, but discerning. It's saying, I will listen, but I will not absorb blindly. It's testing teachings with your life, not just your mind. You learn through observation, through trial, through failure, through stillness. And over time, your own inner compass sharpens. You begin to feel when something is wholesome. You begin to know when something leads to peace. You no longer chase loud opinions, because you've found a quiet knowing inside. Here are 3 questions, simple, yet powerful, to apply this principle in your life. Does this teaching make me more mindful or more reactive? Does it lead to compassion, or does it create division? When I apply it, do I become freer or more rigid? The Kalama principle isn't an excuse to doubt everything forever. It's an invitation to verify through living, to taste truth directly. And when truth is tasted, there's no need to cling. It becomes part of you, like breath, like silence, like still water that reflects everything without distortion. So in the face of modern noise, the internet gurus, the endless opinions, the seductive slogans, remember, not everything that sounds spiritual is wise. Not everything ancient is true. Not everything scientific is helpful. But when you slow down, when you reflect, when you observe outcomes, you will know, and in that knowing, you become free. This is the heart of practical wisdom. To live with curiosity, to listen deeply, to think clearly, to feel honestly, and to follow truth. Not because it's popular, but because it's real. That's how wisdom lives, not in books, not in beliefs, but in you. There's a kind of mind that doesn't rush to believe, but it also doesn't rush to reject. It listens deeply, watches carefully, and walks not in extremes, but in clarity. This is the wise mind, and it walks the middle path. In a world addicted to black and white answers, the middle path feels like a whisper, subtle, easy to miss, but profoundly powerful, because it doesn't swing wildly between blind faith and rigid skepticism. It doesn't live in the prison of certainty, nor drown in the fog of doubt. Instead, it stands still, and it inquires, not to judge, but to understand. The Buddha never said, believe everything I say, nor did he say, trust no one. He said, be a lamp unto yourselves. Work out your own liberation with diligence. This is not an invitation to arrogance. It's a call to responsibility, a reminder that truth isn't handed down like a command. It's discovered, examined, lived, and the mind that discovers it is calm, open, and precise. Soft ambient tones, a gentle bell, then voice resumes reflective, grounded. Walking the middle path of inquiry means you don't cling to your old beliefs just because they're familiar, and you don't reject new ideas just because they're uncomfortable. It means asking, what does this teaching bring out in me? Does it stir kindness or contempt? Does it grow clarity or confusion? The wise mind watches results. It sees cause and effect. It doesn't chase what feels good. It follows what brings lasting peace. Let's make it real. You're introduced to a new spiritual method. Maybe it's trendy. Maybe it sounds strange. Or maybe it challenges everything you've believed for years. The reactive mind will either embrace it blindly or reject it instantly. But the wise mind pauses, observes, reflects. It says, let me try this with awareness. Let me see what it does to my thoughts, my speech, my actions. Over time, if the method leads to mindfulness, to compassion, to non-harming, then it's worth keeping. If not, let it go. No drama, no judgment, just discernment. The middle path of inquiry also means questioning yourself. Gently, it's easy to notice flaws in others' thinking, but true wisdom begins when you shine that same light inward. Ask yourself, am I believing this because it's true or because I want it to be true? Am I rejecting this because it's wrong or because it makes me uncomfortable? Am I mistaking strong emotion for clarity? The wise mind is not afraid to find out it's been wrong because it doesn't worship ego. It serves truth, but walking this path isn't always easy. Sometimes you'll be misunderstood. Others might say you're indecisive. They'll want quick answers, loud opinions, certainty, but wisdom doesn't rush. It ripens like fruit on a tree. Quietly, gradually, from within. You don't owe the world instant conclusions. You owe yourself an honest journey. Remember, inquiry is not about endless doubt. It's about honest exploration. The goal is not to float in uncertainty forever. It's to land gently, on insight, not because someone told you to, not because it's popular, but because you saw clearly what's real. This is how the wise live, with curiosity, with compassion, with calm courage. They don't shout their truth, they embody it. The middle path is not the easy path, but it's the one that liberates, because it doesn't divide the world into believers and doubters, us and them, right and wrong. It brings the light of awareness to everything. It says, walk slowly, look deeply, ask wisely, live truly. And as you keep walking, not chasing truth, but becoming it, you'll find yourself lighter, steadier, and profoundly free, because the wise mind doesn't just seek answers, it seeks understanding. And in that understanding, it learns to live without fear, without clinging, without illusion. So here we are, at the edge of all we've explored. We've walked through doubt and discernment, through the traps of dogma and the power of direct experience. We've listened to the Buddha, paused in the noise, and stood still on the middle path. But now, you're being asked to do something radical, something quietly rebellious, something most people never dare to do. Let go of even this teaching, even this voice, even everything you've learned along the way. Yes, don't believe even this, not because it's wrong, but because the final freedom is the freedom from needing belief at all. Truth, in its purest form, does not require belief. It doesn't ask you to agree, it asks you to see. And once you see clearly, you don't need to hold on to ideas, not even spiritual ones. You don't need to defend your path. You don't need to prove your point. You just live it, quietly, freely, fully. That's what the Buddha meant when he told the Kalamas. When you know for yourselves that these things are wholesome, that they lead to happiness, then follow them. Not because I said so, not because your teacher told you, not because it's written in a book, but because you know, from deep inside, from direct, undistorted, luminous experience, that knowing is not belief, it's insight. There's a story in Zen tradition. A young student asks the master, "What is truth?" The master smiles and says, "Even if I told you, it would become a lie for you. You must see it with your own eyes." We often want someone to give us the answer, a final word, a solid ground, but the ground keeps shifting because life itself is impermanent, and so the true ground is found in groundlessness, when you no longer cling, not even to the path, not even to the idea of enlightenment. That's when it happens, not a moment of fanfare, no fireworks, no booming voice from the sky, just a quiet clarity, a stillness so deep. You finally hear the song of the present moment, and you realize you've always been here. The truth has always been here, waiting for you to stop searching and start seeing. So my friend, don't become a follower of this message. Become a seer of your own truth. Question everything. Trust your experience. Refine your attention. And most of all, stay awake, because the final illusion is that there's something left to believe. The final awakening is seeing there's nothing left to hold. Only then does the mind become truly free, not chained by beliefs, not lost in denial, just open, clear, compassionate. This is the freedom the Buddha pointed to, not obedience, not belief, but liberation. A freedom that arises not when you believe more, but when you need to believe less. So don't believe even this, not until it becomes your own seeing, your own knowing, your own lived truth, and then don't believe it either, just live it deeply, live it silently, live it wisely, because truth doesn't shout. It shines through the one who no longer needs to believe.